If I give you these handouts to start off with, I do have a slightly enlarged handout if anybody needs one, because it sort of did, pass that along please, it did print out a little bit smaller than I was hoping, but as I say, there is a larger version if you need it. Right, today I'm going to talk to you about a subject which is very close to my heart, traditional beer making. First of all, let's just go through a few health and safety issues. Is everybody aware of the fire exit? Straight out there, and the toilets are to the right. We will be handling some chemicals and some yeast today. If you do have any allergies, please let me know and don't handle the yeast in particular. Okay, the learning objective today is to recall the 4 steps of traditional beer making. The difference between traditional beer making and sort of the commercial beer making is traditional beer making is something you can do at home using raw ingredients. Do any of you, or have any of you, ever made beer at home? Just out of interest?
Might have done.
Yeah.
A few years ago.
Did you use
plastic dustbins? I think I remember.
Plastic dustbins. Hooch.
I mainly did wine, but I did do a bit of beer as well in the cask thing, you know,
Yeah.
brown thing. I got rid of it recently.
Did you use the sort of raw ingredients, or?
Well, I used a can, and it all came
Yeah.
with all the instructions,
Yeah, lots
and everything.
yeah. This is a great way to get into it. This is slightly different because we will be using raw ingredients. This is just basically an overview of how you would use raw ingredients. Right, the 4 steps is really quite straightforward. There are only 4 steps involved. There's a lot of sort of mystery about the process of creating beer, but it's a very straightforward, very natural process. The first step of traditional beer making is to make sure that you sterilise all your equipment. Sterilising the equipment can be carried out using all sorts of different chemicals, and I don't know what you've used in the past. Did you bother sterilising before you made your beer, or?
Might have, yes, I think I probably did actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Beer kit, I think you used that. You get all the instructions to a beer kit to do this, don't you?
Yeah, it was all sort of built in.
Yeah. Yes.
There are 3 sort of main chemicals you can use to sterilise your equipment. Some people use bleach, diluted to very sort of thin dilution, so that can kill all the germs. Some people use this stuff, sodium metabisulfite, if you like to just pass that around. It's basically a white powder that you mix with water to a particular ratio, and then you can use that to sterilise all your equipment, which is basically this stuff in front of me. Sodium metabisulfate, once it's in a solution, you can reuse it, so it's quite economical to use, so that's why I use that, rather than things like Camden tablets, which are quite expensive but basically made of the same stuff. Once you've sterilised your equipment, the next step, the second step, is to make what I call a beer soup. So traditional beer making is very much like making soup. It's the same principle. You get your ingredients, prepare them, pop them into boiling water and basically simmer for 15 minutes. And the sort of ingredients that you would use in traditional beer making would be malt. I've got 2 different sorts of malt here. You would use the 2 different types. We've got powdered malt, and we've got what's called cracked malt, and hops. And that's the basic ingredients for a good bitter. Now I don't know if you want to have a quick look at this stuff. We can pass these around. powdered malt is the substance, the ingredient that adds the food for the yeast to carry out fermentation, which is the third stage, which we'll look at in a second. Powdered malt is basically malted barley. It's derived from barley, it's processed and turned into a powder. The other kind of malt that you would put into traditional beer is this kind of malt, which is cracked malt. Now, cracked malt is amazing stuff. It's basically crunched up barley that's been processed. You don't use as much of this as you would of the powdered malt. I don't know if you want to pass that around and have a good sniff. That one's actually called chocolate malt.
Trying to get us high.
Yeah.
Clears your nose out.
Have a good sniff of the malt. Now that is called chocolate malt for a reason. Can you give me an idea what sort of beer you would use a very dark malt like that in?
Brown ale or stout, yeah.
Stout, yeah, brown ale, that's right. Chocolate malt comes in all sorts of different colours basically, and the colour is derived from the length of time that the malt is roasted when it's processed. The darker malt has a much stronger flavour, much stronger smell, so the darker malt you use to create, say, a stout or a darker ale. The lighter malts you'd use for something like a lager or a lighter coloured ale. So all you do is you pop your ingredients, as I say, pop them into boiling water and simmer for 15 minutes, just like you would make a soup. You can experiment by adding all sorts of other ingredients. If you wanted to add fruit juice, you can make, for example, if you added apple juice, you can make an apple ale. All sorts of things. The world, just like any soup, the world is your is your oyster. You can just add anything you like, herbs, refined sugar, honey even. Honey's a good one. Adds a very soft flavour to the beer. Step 3, so after you've made your beer soup, which is technically known as a wort, you want to actually ferment the wort that you've created to create beer. Fermentation is the process whereby yeast turns sugar to alcohol. It's a perfectly natural process. It's what yeast does naturally. It's almost as though, you know, it's yeast's purpose in life is to produce alcohol. As a byproduct, it also creates carbon dioxide. Fermentation is carried out in something like this. This is quite a small little bucket, but you wouldn't need anything bigger than that. I mean, you can create several batches of beer with these sorts of buckets. Some people call them brew pots, some people call them fermenters. But basically, it's a food-grade plastic bucket with a lid on the top. You basically let your wort cool, and you add your yeast, and then you leave it for 7 to 10 days. There are sort of different kinds of yeast. I've got here a dried yeast, but you can also buy live yeast, which is kind of like a gooey. It looks a little like cheese actually, slightly sloppy cheese. But dried yeast is fine. Some beers actually use the wild yeasts that are in the air around us. Some of the more esoteric beers from Belgium, which are called lambic beers. The fourth step, after fermentation, you've basically created your beer after fermentation. It's ready to go. You need to bottle it. Bottling, the first sort of thing that you would need to do is to prime the beer. So you want to add a bit of sparkle to your beer. And to do that, you would take a small sample of beer and add some malt to it, just to add a bit more sugar, and it induces another fermentation in the bottle, so you get a bit of sparkle. And then you would bottle your beer using special bottles. Anybody think of a reason why you'd need to use special bottles for bottling homebrew?
Keep it fizzy.
Sorry?
Keep beer fizzy.
Keep your beer fizzy, yeah.
Doesn't go flat.
Fermentation is going to continue
Yeah.
in the bottles.
So it's
producing
producing
CO2,
Yeah.
so you need a good strong captive.
So for safety reasons, you always need to use good strong bottles. A lot of people use plastic bottles because they just don't explode. But if you get special homebrew bottles, like those, or like those with the top on, those are the best option. And finally, you would just use a bottle capping machine like this one here, and you would pop a cap on the bottle. Just pop one of these on there, and then you would press that down to put the cap on. Right, this is a bit of a whiz through the basic principles of beer making. Basically, just to remind you, the 4 basic steps of beer making. First step, sterilise. Second step, make your beer soup. Third step, ferment your beer. And then 4th step, bottle your beer and pop it away. And then it will be ready in a couple of weeks to drink with your friends, or on your own, or however you want to drink it. So, making traditional beer is really simple. You don't need that much room to do it. Basically this is all you need to create some really good tasting beer. There are lots of online resources that you can look at on the web, lots of tutorials if you want to take this further. Right, I think if we just do a quick quiz before I finish, what I'd like to do is just go around the room and see if you can recall. I thought Kelly might have been involved in this bit, but it's fine. We'll just go around. So Susan, can you recall what the first step in traditional homebrewing is?
Sterilising?
Correct. Well done. Andy, second step?
Making soup.
Making soup. Brilliant, yeah. Third step, Paul?
Fermentation.
Fermentation. Excellent. And 4th step? Susan?
Oh, yeah, I was going to say, bottling it and drinking. You've got me there on that.
Yeah.
That's right, bottling it and drinking.
That's
Best step.
That's basically, it's a very simple process. Often people get a bit kind of think it's more than it actually is, but it's a very natural, simple process. Does anybody have any questions about the process?
How strong is the beer that comes from homebrew? Because I can recall it being very strong.
It depends how much sugar you put in.
Right.
So
Can you control that though?
Yeah, depending on the kind of beer that you want, you would put in varying amounts of this stuff. So if you look online, there are all sorts of recipes of varying strengths. So for an ordinary bog standard kind of bitter, tasty bitter, would probably have 170 grams of this per, I think I'll put some instructions down, per litre, or per 4.5 litres. You can, if you add something like honey, you're introducing more sugar, so you get a much stronger beer. So that's
Is that why the honey beers are really
they have a bit
strong then?
of a kick, yeah.
They do.
I think I'm right in saying there will become a point where fermentation will stop because the sugar stops. The yeast that's being destroyed by the sugar.
Yeah.
So therefore fermentation stops.
Yeah.
And then you're going to start thinking about distilling it then again.
When the yeast has sort of got through all the sugar in the fermentation, in the fermenter or the brew pot, then it starts to become inactive. It doesn't produce carbon dioxide, so the lid on your fermenter won't be popping up or won't be bulging. So that's when you know when your beer's finished fermenting, which is a very good point, which I should have mentioned earlier. But, yeah. Excellent. Right, and that's it. My short introduction to home brewing.
Okay, well done.
Thank you.
There's another interesting